today's talk is so many directions, which way do we go? The theme this month is about the responsibility of responding to those who are vulnerable. In the song that was sung, how many of us find times when we feel lost? And how many of us find that when we're in the midst of those lost feelings, that either internally we get a myriad of voices about where we should go. I had a dream, literally, not this waking up this morning, but yesterday, and the dream was about how we are told to be a certain way, and we manage to fit ourselves in to that way that we're told to be. How many directions guide us and shape us. I wanted us to reflect on this message from Ernest Holmes. Listen to the call to give of ourselves in love and service to others, in a spirit of generosity and good friendship. To refuse to give is to refuse to receive, for everything moves in circles. A kind word, a thoughtful act, perhaps just a smile can help lighten the burden of others. With a world so full of difficulty, we can feel hugely challenged. Right after I graduated from college, I joined a service program, and it was called Channel. And one of the elements in Channel was that when you finished your year, you would do a presentation to share about what it is that you learned. Now, I'm not going to share what I shared, but the one that struck me the most was one of the people that was in the same year as me. It was a 2-year program, and so we were all first years. And when she spoke, it was sitting down, and this was very unusual because this was a woman who was so powerful. And she was someone who always stood up. So for her to do her presentation from a seated position demonstrated something very different. And from that seat, she was essentially reciting the features of a poem that she was living. That there were so many things that were calling to her heart. And she didn't know how she could be present to all of those things. She didn't know how that she could fulfill all of those things. You know, so it was right after I was in college, so, you know, back when the pterodactyls were running around on the planet, and, you know, they were flying overhead, and, you know, people could laugh at the dinosaurs playing. It was a time where there was still the threat of nuclear war, that people could be dumb enough, that we were in this position of mad, that there was this race, that the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in this one-upsmanship. One-upsmanship would have been the term used then, and I'm going to reject the manship. But there was that constant sense of, will today be the last day? Will some idiot decide to press a button that will just destroy life as we know it on the planet? So there was that whole political threat, that dynamic. There was the beginning inklings that what we were doing to the planet was not a good thing. And she, as a lesbian woman who had come out, that was her thing during the year. She'd come out. And she talked about what it's like to be a woman, and then to be a lesbian woman, and all of the expectations that were placed on her, how she was falling short of what her family expected, how she was different from what people expected, and how just being a woman in general was not some picnic. That the onus, the burden that women had to carry, and the lack of respect, the lack of dignity, the lack of acknowledgement. And I would largely say that there's been very limited progress on that front. I mean, when we think about the presidential election with Hillary Clinton, it was still about how did she look and how nice was she. It was trying to cram her back in to these boxes. And similarly with Elizabeth Warren, I mean, how likable is she? Nobody's asking that of the male people that are running. In fact, it's kind of the counter of that. If you were at all likable, you're probably not appropriate.
Yeah.
And yet, to be a woman running, you have to be likable. You have to have a likability factor. For the vulnerable, there's always this call. When we find ourselves in a position of vulnerability, we feel like we have to fit in somehow. I told Stephanie that I was going to be weaving parts of today's talk in with the story of Cinderella. And the reason that I want to do that is that there are elements of that story that I think really illuminate what I want to share today about how we respond to vulnerability. About how we choose paths in response to vulnerability. How we take up responsibility in response to vulnerability. Now, maybe you already knew this, but the story of Cinderella goes back thousands of years. It was first written down by a Greek person who told the story of this Egyptian, well, she was born in Egypt, but she was a Greek woman, and she was born in a household of slaves. And she lost her shoe. An eagle came down and grabbed her shoe and flew it to the Pharaoh's home. And in the Pharaoh's home, it landed on the Pharaoh while he was making a decree. And he really took this as a portent. You know, you're in the middle of making a decree and suddenly you have a shoe land on you. It's like, how many times do we feel like we have something drop out of the blue, drop out of the air, that there's a message in that for us? And it changes how we go and how we move and where we take that message. So prior to the eagle dropping the shoe there, he had no idea that this woman, Rodolphus, I think is how you say it. He had no idea that she even existed. But suddenly it all turned around and it was his mission to find her. So he ordered the people of his guard to scour the earth and find her. And they did. And they brought her back and they made her queen. So she went from being a slave to being the queen. Now, isn't that the perfect outcome for the vulnerable? That this enslaved woman is raised to the status of queen. I think this is an important myth for us to consider because ultimately, each of us are a place of the power of ruling. Each of us are a place of reigning over domains. And yet, as long as she only saw herself as a slave, it wasn't even possible. It was the intervention of the eagle. So one thing that we can do is, how might we choose to be eagles for one another? Maybe the fact that you're called back to that woman who's kind of miserable and that you don't really like, maybe your presence is an eagle spirit to that person. And that person may never appreciate it. That person may grind you down and may want to pull out your feathers because it may feel threatening. Because you are a vivid, amazing presence. But maybe that's what you have to offer there. I want us to ask What are the worldviews that we carry around that get drawn into us, that give us an idea about our own vulnerability, that give us ideas about the vulnerability in the world? How is it that I, as a white man, am endowed with certain privileges that I've never done a lick's worth of work to earn, but that are simply conveyed? Isn't that all about a story that gets rolled out? One of the things that's been said is remarkable about the Torah is that it's lasted as long as it had, because the Torah was the storybook of a people that was defeated over and over and over again. It was filled with stories of people who were not necessarily heroic, people who made mistakes. Cinderella, when you're familiar with the story, this is not a heroine in the classic sense. This is a girl who has been subjected to going from being the daughter of the household to being the scullery. Sometimes there are stories all around us, and how much do we embrace and claim and hold on to those stories? And when do we decide to pause and ask, do I want to continue to tell this story this way? One of the things that gets called to me from my position of privilege as a white man is, how do I interrupt that privilege? How do I call it out? How do I say that it's going on, that it has taken me to places? And how do I use it? How do I leverage it to advance things for other people? That's one of the things that gets called to me. The thing that I can practice in face of it is to pay attention, to see when is it giving me advantages, and how do I keep my foot in the door so that those that don't have those advantages can get through. The story of Cinderella, one of the things about it is it's been told in many, many different ways. There's the Grimm's brothers, there's the Disney version, there's a real twisted take on it, Ella Enchanted. There's a movie, Enchanted, and all of it basically says the same thing, but it comes at it through different viewpoints. There's even Daniel McGuire did the story of Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. C.S. Lewis did the story Till We Have Faces. Till we have faces. And it's from a different perspective. One of the things that we can be called to do to respond to vulnerability is to be willing, with so many choices, to start to follow the threads so that we understand the story from a different perspective. How might we see it in an unexpected way? So, in the story of Ella Enchanted, for example, are you familiar with that one?
No.
Ella is Cinderella. Ella is ostensibly gifted by the fairies with only the capacity to do what she's told to do. She cannot disobey. And the fairy gave it to her thinking that this would be a great gift. What could be better? You'll never have conflict because you'll always obey. Ella didn't find it quite so enchanting. It was a struggle. In that story, instead of the fairies being these like well-meaning, I mean they are well-meaning, but instead of just patently good, it carries with it a burden. To be only obedient comes at a cost. How many times do we feel that to respond only obediently costs a piece of our soul? How might we use that experience to take a moment of understanding for those around that we see as vulnerable? How often are people given one track and they're supposed to follow that one track, and if they get out of that lineup on that track, it's all their fault? I think some of you are familiar with the book of Job, which is a book in the Torah, the Old Testament, as the Christians assimilated it and took it away. Job's story is not really a happy one at the point that you follow the story. And what it presents is, it's actually an argument about the genesis of misfortune. And it's also set up as this game where God and Satan have kind of pitted one against each other. And God had said, you know, Job is my most obedient dude. And Satan is like, hey, you know, if I mess around with him, you'll see that he's not really as good as you think he is. So much of the story is about how far Satan can push him. And, you know, he had been a wealthy man with many children and a very good life. You know, and when you get into the story, that is gone pretty quickly. And then Job has these three visitors who basically give the analysis for helping him understand why he's vulnerable the way he is. You know, one of those positions is, well, you know, in your heart, you weren't a very good man. This is what comes, you know, this is the sign. You thought you were good, this proves it. Now, I only say this because in science of mind teaching, sometimes there's this hidden idea that it's all in our consciousness. So anything that unfolds before us is really just it's our consciousness coming forward and expressing. So there can be a blaming element that can emerge in New Thought communities. And people who are undergoing difficulties can feel alienated because it's like, you say that I have all of this power, and yet there is this immense difficulty that I'm passing through, and how do I claim my power in this midst, when you're saying that I'm the one that's responsible, I'm the one that created this mess that lies before me? What in your consciousness calls that? And has anyone ever had that question asked? And is the response that comes from within, thank you. Thank you for helping me inquire about that. Thank you for having me look inside and seeing how my fracked up consciousness created this miserable picture. So the invitation there is that experience of blame does not support the vulnerable. I mean, one of the ways of understanding the Cinderella story is that the stepmother blames Cinderella's father, who's lost everything and who's died. She thought she was marrying into a wealthy family. She thought that he would have sufficient means to take care of her two daughters and his own daughter, but he didn't. And she had to make hard choices as a mother. She had her own two daughters that she loved, and she had this adopted daughter who, you know, she didn't really feel already connected with. You know, and as readers of the story, the way the story gets presented, the heroine is Cinderella. She's that poor little orphaned girl. We don't feel particularly sorry for the stepmother. I mean, have you ever seen a presentation where the stepmother is presented in a way that you're like, oh, baby, oh, it's so sad for you? Or the stepsisters, it's not really like, oh, I'm sorry that it didn't work out. No, we're kind of like, you know, as the story unfolds, we're not rooting for them. We're like, you bitches. You are just so mean. I mean, poor Cinderella, the only friends she has, according to Walt Disney, are these mice. She's got mice and birds and this stuff, but, you know, that's not really a very good friendship. I mean, maybe it works if you're autistic, and we've never really explored Cinderella as the story of the autistic girl with her animal friends.
Oh. There's a new one.
But as the story unfolds, we follow a particular track.
Our familiar track.
We follow a familiar track. And then we look, and we're in the Disney version, it's the fairy godmother. She comes out of nowhere and helps. Who among us would not care to have a fairy godmother just pop up every once in a while? You're needing a new dress? Here, sweetie, we've got that. That old nasty car you're driving, look, it's now a Cadillac. It's now a, it's a Tesla. It's a Tesla. And you just plug it in, and you get good mileage, and your electricity is covered by the place where you're living. The rent covers your electricity, so your car is moving easily, and it's all good. I mean, would anybody really object to that kind of stepmother? Or that kind of godmother? In another version of the story, the fairy godmother is just a stranger who shows up. And out of all the people in the household, Cinderella is the only one who treats her with compassion. And her response is to gift Cinderella and to acknowledge the generosity that Cinderella had. You know, her sisters and stepmother were off to the ball, and she's being nice to this woman who came along when she's trying to scrape together the things for her dress. But she doesn't stick to her own thing. She, at her most miserable point, goes to help somebody else. So sometimes, in the story of Cinderella, here's this vulnerable girl, and she takes a moment to help somebody else. It's a little bit like that line that Ernest Holmes said, to refuse to give is to refuse to receive. How hard does it feel sometimes when we feel like we have nothing, that we're supposed to give something? What might we still have left to give when we think we have nothing? So to be with different worldviews, to take on different visions, to take on different aspects, to engage in that story differently. How many of you are familiar with the story of Pretty Woman? Mm-hmm. There's another modern Cinderella story. And she's so articulate about it. She envisions that the ending is that the hero, the prince, is going to come on the horse, and when he and she split up, and he's realized, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I done? I found the perfect person. I found the perfect person, and I let my circumstances tell me no. So he went back, and he climbed her fire escape, doing the thing that he's most terrified of doing. And she retells the story. She reclaims it, that she's part of his salvation. Rather than the princess being, rather than the soon-to-be princess by marriage is saved by the prince, she owns it. That it's the princess who saves the prince. And that was the experience in Pretty Woman. She saved him. She saved him from his soul being dead. She saved him from his inability to see how he connected to a bigger world. How many of us would imagine in the story of Cinderella that it's this prostitute who's doing that because she landed in circumstances that are just terrible? And she has bigger visions for her life. And when she's got some extra money, she gives it to her friend, so her friend can open her hairdress, follow her hairdressing courses. To refuse to give is to refuse to receive. The character chose to give. How do we choose to give? How do we choose to give? In the Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister and in Till We Have Faces, the story is told from the vantage point of the different sisters. Again, the stories as they're typically told don't ever invite us to step into a different perspective. The funny thing about the story of the Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, it's being told by the younger of the two daughters. She's the narrator. And she's describing their lives. And unlike the normal routine that we hear, the older sister is a sister who is really struggling. She's got some limitations. And the younger sister struggles in her own way. She was raised by this overly protected mother who never wanted her out of the house. And that middle sister, the confession of the ugly stepsister, so to speak, it gets reported about her mother saying that hounds had more attractive faces than this daughter.
Oh.
Who did?
Hounds.
The narrator describes that, dogs have more attractive faces than this one daughter.
Oh.
But what this ugly daughter finds is that she falls in love with a painter. And she becomes a painter herself. So this person who is ostensibly dismissed as not attractive becomes this means through which beauty comes into the world. In that story, there's a different outcome. What you end up finding out is that maybe the narrator isn't who you think it is. So I'll leave it at that, so that you might, if you ever want to explore Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, you can look it up. I'm not going to tell you the outcome. Daniel McGuire, he's the same one who did Wicked.
Oh, okay.
Gregory McGuire.
So it's a play?
It's a
They're all
book.
books.
It's a book.
It's
Okay.
a book. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. Ultimately, to step into the role of contending with the vulnerable, it's a process of joining hands and finding power together. How often might we fall into the trap of thinking that we're there to fix it? To be the fix for other people? Kind of seductive, isn't it? That notion that we can be the solution. But when people come into our lives and want to fix us, how do we feel about that? Are we like, woo, here you are, you're fixing me? We tend to, I won't say the we, I will say that when people, I continue to have, when people nag me, I get very, very resistant. I'm like, you nag me, I'm much less likely to even do what you're doing to suggest that. I'm just nagging you because I know that if you get this done, you'll feel much better. I might feel better, but you're nagging me, and so I'm not going to do it. I just, there's the clinical term is oppositional defiant. You tell me I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do that. How many of us have seen children do that?
We have done it ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to put the ownership on anybody but myself. I'm just saying. It was a thing that happened a lot in my teenage years with my mother. She's like, if you would just do this, it would all work out fine. Uh-huh. And now I'm not going to do that at all. Uh-huh. Part of vulnerability is a feeling of powerlessness. And to the extent that giving others direction, if it only does it to empower us, to feel like, aren't I better? I'm picking you up out of that quagmire you're in. It's only self-serving. The call that religious science inspires is my own personal empowerment and empowerment for all that are on the planet. It's an idea central to the Buddhist practices. The idea is that we seek enlightenment, but the truly enlightened doesn't then arrive in nirvana because they've received enlightenment. They come back as what's characterized as bodhisattvas because they are about triggering and igniting empowerment and nirvana for others. In the various stories of Cinderella, the outcome is that she becomes the ruler. She becomes in charge of the realm. She's not just the poor scullery girl. Just as in the original story of the slave in Egypt, she becomes the co-ruler of the realm. How is it that we lift up the vulnerable as co-rulers, as people who share dominion? So when we offer to give help, are we giving help to soothe ourselves, period? And if we've done that, fine. It's maybe our first step. But like the Cinderella story, how do we keep pulling it apart and looking at it from another perspective? In one version of it, Cinderella forgives the stepmother. She doesn't do what is so often and so tempting to exile the stepmother and the stepsisters to oblivion, to let them wander the kingdom or be exiled from the kingdom. How do we see it within our hearts to empower others? And so it is.